China is often perceived as a stable system. Public disputes are rare, visible crises are limited, and sudden system-breaking shocks, the kind commonly seen in louder, more turbulent political environments, seldom appear. Yet over the past few months, a quiet paradox has begun to surface. On the surface, the machinery continues to operate smoothly, with no obvious signs of disruption. But internally, several critical nodes have been repeatedly replaced, investigated, or quietly removed from positions they once occupied. There are no gunshots, no large-scale protests, and no credible evidence suggesting that an armed internal conflict is taking shape. And it is precisely for this reason that the current phase deserves close attention. In highly centralized systems, the most dangerous changes rarely begin with chaos. They begin with silence, with what does not happen, more than with what unfolds openly. Looking at verified reporting from reputable international media, a common pattern emerges. Recent internal shifts in China do not appear spontaneous, but rather resemble a deliberate process of adjustment. Senior personnel changes have become more frequent. Certain key positions within the military and political apparatus have been reshuffled. Investigations are announced in firm, uncompromising language, while substantive details remain minimal. All of this unfolds in an orderly manner. There is no chain reaction, no visible public resistance. From the outside, this can easily be misread as stability. But when the question is reversed, the picture begins to change. Why would a system that prioritizes continuity and an image of solidity accept multiple sensitive adjustments at the same time? And why do these adjustments concentrate on areas long regarded as pillars of control and decision-making? Here, an important distinction becomes necessary. Instability does not have to take the form of open conflict. In many cases, it exists as accumulated pressure, when internal components no longer function as smoothly as before, even while the surface remains intact. Viewed this way, what is happening in China today resembles a phase of compression. Problems do not explode outward, but neither do they disappear. They are contained, tightly managed, and addressed with minimal noise. This is clearly reflected in the tone of official communication. The language is technical, emotionally restrained, and avoids interpretation. There is no excessive reassurance, but neither is there any explicit acknowledgement of instability. This selective silence is not accidental. It suggests that the primary priority at this moment is not persuading external audiences, but preventing internal structures from becoming unsettled. And it is at this point that a more consequential question emerges. Why is the current phase more sensitive than previous ones? Looking back at recent history, China has gone through multiple major adjustment cycles. Not all were smooth, but most occurred during periods of strong economic growth, wide policy flexibility, and a less confrontational international environment. Those conditions no longer fully exist. Economic pressure is no longer short-term. Growth has slowed, the property sector remains fragile, and private sector confidence has eroded over time. These factors do not trigger immediate crisis, but they produce a prolonged state of fatigue. Alongside this runs a quieter social pressure. Youth unemployment, a growing sense of limited opportunity, and the widening gap between expectations and reality are becoming increasingly visible. These dynamics are difficult to quantify, yet deeply influential in shaping collective sentiment. Above all, the international environment has changed significantly. Strategic competition has intensified. Diplomatic flexibility has narrowed. Options once seen as buffers have become far more complex. When these pressures coexist, any internal adjustment carries greater weight than usual. Not because the adjustment itself is extreme, but because the margin for error has narrowed. In this context, tightening discipline and control appears as a systemic reflex. It is meant to reduce risk, reinforce cohesion, and prevent unpredictable internal deviations. Yet this strategy comes with unavoidable side effects. As control intensifies, flexibility in response often declines. Negative information travels more slowly. Early warning signals are more easily blurred or delayed before reaching decision points. In large systems, this is a familiar paradox. The stronger the drive for absolute stability, the easier it becomes to overlook small but critical shifts. And when those shifts accumulate over time, the cost of adjustment rises sharply. This does not mean China is approaching an imminent crisis. It would be a mistake to assign extreme scenarios to the present phase, but it would be equally imprudent to dismiss these developments as merely routine internal affairs. At this moment, what matters most is not what has already happened, but what has not. There has been no explosion, no cascading reaction, no public rupture of the existing order. And it is precisely this state of not yet that constitutes the core issue. In many cases, the most dangerous phases are not when crises erupt, but when everything remains under control, requiring increasing force simply to keep it stationary. Taken together, these elements suggest that China is currently in a state of managed tension. Not chaotic, but not fully at ease. Not out of control, but requiring constant adjustment to avoid slippage. From this condition, broader effects begin to extend beyond the internal domain. But that is the subject of the next phase. From the outside, China still appears as a vast machine, operating steadily with limited visible fluctuation. Official messages emphasize stability, control, and order. Yet when viewed against the backdrop of accumulating internal pressures, China's external behavior begins to display subtler, more cautious, and less predictable tones. In many instances, when internal pressure builds, the natural response of a large system is not to expand outward, but to tighten inward, to maintain rhythm, prevent deviation, and preserve control. This does not imply that China will act more aggressively across all external fronts. On the contrary, from a logical standpoint, Beijing is likely to prioritize avoiding major external shocks, as any sharp disruption could compound existing internal strains. However, this posture of simultaneous tightening and shock avoidance creates a paradox. While seeking to avoid escalation, China must still project sufficient firmness to avoid being perceived as weak. As a result, the world may observe strong rhetoric and symbolic gestures accompanied by clear restraint when it comes to crossing irreversible thresholds. This is a familiar pattern of behavior for an actor attempting to maintain balance within an increasingly, if not constrained, strategic space. Within this framework, the United States emerges as an unavoidable variable, not because Washington controls internal developments in China, but because any strategic recalibration in Beijing must account for American responses. From a perspective of interests, the United States may perceive strategic opportunities when China's attention is divided by internal concerns. At the same time, Washington faces its own dilemma: how to utilize strategic space without pushing the situation beyond a stable threshold. It is important to emphasize that there is no clear indication the United States is actively seeking to destabilize China. In reality, prolonged instability in China is not an ideal scenario for Washington. Excessive uncertainty from an economy and power center of China's scale could generate ripple effects across global markets, trade networks, and the strategic alliances upon which the United States relies. Consequently, the American response is more likely to be adaptive rather than confrontational. Observers may notice greater caution in messaging, increased diplomatic flexibility, and an effort to avoid actions that could be interpreted as unnecessary provocation. This does not alter the fundamental nature of US-China competition, but it complicates its tempo and mechanics. The impact of these dynamics extends beyond the two countries. In the global economy, any signal of instability from China is rapidly reflected in markets, not always through sharp downturns, but through heightened caution. Capital flows become more conservative. Businesses delay decisions. Supply chains, already under strain in recent years, continue to be reviewed and adjusted. Here, the key feature is not abrupt rupture, but gradual shift. Global firms may not exit China immediately, but they increasingly seek contingency options. Dependence is reduced incrementally. This process is quiet, but over time it can reshape the global economic structure in ways that are difficult to reverse. Geopolitically, allies and partners of both the United States and China also enter a posture of careful observation. They do not wish to be drawn into a larger confrontation, yet cannot remain entirely detached. As China focuses more on internal stabilization, regional actors may sense small strategic gaps, accompanied by heightened uncertainty. From this point, several possible trajectories can be outlined, not as predictions, but as ways the situation might evolve. One scenario is that China maintains stability through tighter control. Internal pressures persist but remain within manageable bounds. External behavior stays relatively cautious, avoiding major conflicts, while prioritizing a stable external environment to address domestic concerns. This is a continuation scenario, low shock, but marked by sustained underlying tension. A second scenario involves prolonged instability without escalation into major crises. Economic and social pressures remain unresolved. Control measures intensify but yield only temporary effects. In this case, external behavior may appear more erratic, not due to strategic shifts, but because the system must continually adapt to emerging variables. Finally, there is a low probability, high impact scenario, a major disruption that breaks the existing balance. This could stem from an economic shock, an unexpected political event, or the cumulative interaction of smaller stresses over time. Control mechanisms would be severely tested, not necessarily resulting in immediate chaos, but sufficient to alter how China engages with the world for a period. Importantly, these scenarios are not mutually exclusive. Reality may lie somewhere in between, with elements of each overlapping. This makes monitoring indicators more valuable than attempting to forecast a single outcome. Those indicators may be subtle. Senior personnel changes, unexplained yet increasingly frequent, warrant attention. Shifts in official language, whether harder or more opaque, often signal changing priorities. Market reactions, domestic and international alike, serve as sensitive gauges of confidence and expectations. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy is equally significant. Undisclosed meetings and brief, conciliatory joint statements can reveal more than headline declarations. They suggest ongoing efforts to keep existing breaks functional, even as tensions remain unresolved. Taken together, these pieces point to a sensitive phase in which stability is no longer a default condition, but the outcome of continuous adjustment. This does not imply an imminent crisis, but it does render strategic calculations more fragile. Perhaps most importantly, the central issue is not what will happen next, but how actors respond to uncertainty. History shows that major shifts often arise not from a single decision, but from a sequence of small adjustments unfolding quietly. The story therefore remains open, and developments in the period ahead, even seemingly minor ones, may reshape the broader trajectory. We will continue to monitor and analyze these dynamics in future updates. Until then,